Tina Fuller was a behavioural optometrist, and she always knew that she operated a little differently to the other people in her industry. She was very in tune with that intuitive sense. She always understood the process and trusted that what she felt was what was right. She had been through a lot of change in her life. Anxiety had played a key role in her choices and emotions right from when she was really young. And even though she didn't understand that anxiety was what others called that feeling, she just thought that was normal. Imagine her surprise and confusion as she awoke one day and felt like life was different, suddenly freer in the absence of anxiety. This is how the awareness became apparent to Tina right out of the blue. And she discusses in her episode her why, her how, and what she now chooses to do in order to prevent anxiety from interfering with her full potential in her life as she continues to develop her new business ventures and ongoing personal development. Tina and I had a fantastic interview, and you'll hear at the end a little bit of both of us operating within our intuitive superpowers. We both understand how important it is to trust the process. We both felt and saw a strong connection during the interview process, and I know that so many of you will relate to Tina and her way of thinking, including the reasons why she went back to understand why that anxiety was there in the first place, and the difficulty in having to do that process as an adult, to go right back to a child and find the root cause of why you were the way you were and how that affected you as an adult. And she talks a lot about the healing process and how wonderful it is that she was able to recognize the importance of going through that process, getting help and support where she needed it, to now be the free and fantastic Tina Fuller that I know today.
Have you ever had one of those gut-wrenching moments where life ground you to your knees and you found yourself asking in despair, why me? This podcast is all about sharing your stories and journeys, from asking why me to declaring this is why me. Discover how ordinary human beings like you and I have found their extraordinary levels of hope, courage, compassion, and provided a new perspective for greater potential and self-empowerment during their darkest defining moment. As a creative artist and coach myself, my guests and I discuss the interconnectedness of emotion and transformation in those moments, and how their actions then seize the opportunity for discovering their unfiltered and authentic voice, and ultimately their life's purpose. I invite you to join me each week as we share insights into how adversity can be turned into a unique advantage. Today's guest is Tina Fuller from Australia, who runs a holistic health service. She is a personal coach and education consultant who aims to help you get the most out of your life through integration of the mind, body, and spirit connection. I'm going to read a quote from a post you made a week ago, Tina, which accompanied a photo of your mirror covered in post-it notes, where you discuss the realization of having lived with anxiety most of your life and how it felt when you woke one day without it. The quote is, "What worked for me was mainly body-based somatic techniques. I like them because they're not about rehearsing the past. It's all about understanding our nervous system, how it works, why it reacts, and then bringing it into the present. In other words, rewiring the brain so that it doesn't react with fear to something that hasn't happened yet or that may have happened a long time ago. And you then go on to say, my body told me what it needed. My only job was to notice and then find a space where I could allow things to come out in whatever way they needed to without being arrested or taken to a mental health clinic. Welcome to the WhyMe podcast, Tina.
Hi, Vera. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. And we start with the big questions here first, such as, who's been the most influential person in your life, Tina?
But I would have to say, if I'm speaking of me here now, Peter Levine. Peter Levine is the person who's behind somatic experiencing, and it's just one of those things that I fell upon because I was researching something for a client, a young girl that I was working with, and it changed my life totally.
I love it when that happens. How about books? Have you got a particular book that's really impacted you?
Well, again, I'll go back to Peter Levine's Waking the Tiger. It's all about how the nervous system holds on to emotions, trauma, everything that's happened in our past that hasn't been released, that hasn't been dealt with. It's all in there. And I had no idea. So when I was reading this book and trying some of the things in it, so many things just suddenly fell into place for me. So totally life-changing.
Yeah, that's awesome. My bucket list is growing of all of the books that people are telling me about and all the places they've been and all of these wonderful things that people have experienced. So my list is like, it's expanding every interview. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think they come into our lives at the right time too, so I've had all these books on my list, or they might be sitting on my bookshelf, and then all of a sudden my eye will fall on them and I'll go, I'm going to read that now, and it's exactly what I need.
Yeah, fantastic. I have had very similar experiences, not only with books or groups, but people as well. I find that people tend to come into your life quite often at the right time, even if you don't recognize it at that time.
Yes, yeah, totally. It's actually funny because the way that I learned about Peter Levine was I had a misunderstanding with a friend. So I messaged her and said, why don't we meet and talk about your vision? And I was working as a behavioural optometrist at the time. And I just checked her eyes. So I was talking about her vision, as in her eyesight. And she thought I meant, let's talk about your vision for the future. And that's when she told me about this book. So it was a total misunderstanding, or the perfect understanding.
Yes.
That led me to it.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that story, Tina. Serendipity.
Yeah, it's goosebumpy for me even now, years later. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Well, look, how about we get into your story, a little bit about one of your defining moments in your life?
Sure. So my defining moment was laying in bed one morning and feeling really strange. I remember waking up and opening my eyes. I was in my 40s. And I thought, wow, this is weird. I don't think I've felt like this before. And it was a feeling of peace. There was no butterflies in my stomach.
Right.
For the first time in my life. And I had literally, for 40 plus years, I had no idea that you could feel like that. I just laid there for, I think, an hour or two and thought, wow, this is nice. I don't want this to end. I'm staying here forever. This is great. And that's how I realized that this anxiety stuff that other people talked about, that I thought was all about being really nervy and you can't go in front of people and you can't work. And I thought anxiety was this extreme thing that other people suffered from. I suddenly that morning realized that that's what I'd had all my life, but it was just normal for me.
Right. It is
Yeah.
such a moment to feel that relief, I suppose. Would you call it relief in that moment with that calmness and that peace?
Look, I don't think it was relief at the time. I think it was total. I was literally in shock. It was
Right.
total surprise, and I didn't quite not to know what to do with it. And I guess there was almost a fear that the other feeling would now come back, and I really didn't want it to. So that's when I set off on a journey to explore how I got to this feeling. What happened? What happened to make my anxiety suddenly go away? Why wasn't it there all of a sudden? And I discovered that the way I got to this point was by I had done some courses on primitive reflexes, again, for clients. I was working with children with learning difficulties and with nervous system disorders. So I was doing all these courses for my clients, and because they were hands-on courses, I had to do all the exercises. And I've been a person that never advises anything that I haven't tried myself.
Right.
So I'd spent the previous, I can't remember how long, but months, probably 6 months, doing these daily exercises. And in that same time period, amazingly, my friend put me onto Peter Levine's work. So I was doing some of his exercises to help this little girl who would come into my office and was just frozen behind the door and just went into this total freeze response. So these two things together, I realized, even though I thought I was doing them to help other people, actually suddenly resulted in my nervous system coming into a state where all of the stuff that it had been holding on to was suddenly gone. And
Wow.
and there I was without it. My anxiety was no longer with me. Now I have to say it did return later on, but I then knew the pathway, so now I'm anxiety free.
Wow. So I'd love to know how you worked out that pathway. And was there fear in or even anxiety in taking a step into that pathway? Because having lived with the anxiety for so long, even though you weren't aware that that's what it was, and as you said, it just felt normal for you, that would have been quite a new experience for you. And for a lot of people, new and uncertainty is difficult to then step into. How did you work through that?
Um, Look, there was fear, and there were a lot of things that happened either as a result of it or leading up to it. And it's, as is often true in life, it's sometimes very difficult for me to think back and work out what was the cause and what was the effect. So what happened for me is I woke up on this morning and was anxiety free. So then, of course, I started to explore why I had anxiety all this time. So although there wasn't fear attached to me finding the pathway or repeating that pathway, I've always been into exploration and finding how a human body mind system works. So that part was actually very exciting for me, and to have myself as a guinea pig was actually quite an exciting thing.
Right.
What wasn't so exciting was delving into my past and actually my present. I was still married at the time. Shakily diving into my past and my present to find why the anxiety had been there in the first place. And that was that's diving into that did bring some of it back, because I discovered things about my childhood that contributed to it. I discovered things about my marriage that had contributed to it. I learned about toxic relationships and emotional manipulation and all of that shitty, horrible, ugly stuff that that I hadn't been aware of. I thought because I was functioning in society and I had a fairly good job, fairly good career, I was helping people, I was doing a lot. And now I know that that was because of my anxiety. That's what was easing it.
Yes.
But I was always on the go doing this and that and totally ignoring the problems in my life that were right in front of me, fueling this anxious state. So I was stuck on this merry-go-round. And it wasn't the stepping off the merry-go-round that was difficult. It was finding out what the merry-go-round consisted of that was quite traumatic and hard.
Right. So would it be fair to say, just listening to you talking about that moment as the absence and the different feeling because of the absence of anxiety, basically for the first time you're aware, would it be fair to say that when you were in that anxious state, you were subconsciously somehow closing off that information, because then realizing that you were essentially released from that anxiety, you've gone straight into working out the why, essentially, and realizing these things, as you said, that you weren't aware of, although they'd always been there, they'd always happened, and you remembered them, but you hadn't focused on them before in that light, perhaps. How do you respond to that?
I think you're spot on. So what I've been able to work out, what I was able to work out over the years that followed, was that my keeping myself busy, doing things all the time. So I had a business, I was homeschooling my kids, I was running a farm, and doing many other things at the same time. That was my addiction. So I've since read some of Gabor Mate's work, and his book, The Realm of the Hungry Ghost, talks about addictions and talks about how there are addictions that are not acceptable by society, but then there are those that are quite acceptable, like overachieving and doing lots of stuff. And I realized that that was my escape. So yes, I was totally shutting off to the reality of what was going on around me by keeping myself busy all the time. I never sat down. I survived on 4, maybe 5 hours sleep a night because there was all these things that I believed I had to do. And I guess I did. My nervous system was telling me that I had to keep busy, otherwise I would have to stop and face what was actually going on.
Yes. I'm going to ask you a question now that may be a little difficult to answer, but go with me for a moment.
Sure.
A lot of my experiences with clients and people that I know who've worked through different traumas or difficult adversity in their life as an adult, so coming back out of it and then looking back to work out their why, a lot of those people, and myself included at one point in my life, had difficulty sitting in the quiet with myself. And, for example, would have a lot of difficulty with standing in front of a mirror and looking at our own reflection and being comfortable with the person looking back at us. When you've just spoken about keeping busy because you didn't want, in a way, to have to deal with that stuff, how long did it take you before you could be present with yourself in that moment with everything that may come up?
Well, I've got 2 answers to that. One answer is about 2 years to get to a place of complete peace with myself and acceptance of the part that I played in my marriage, in the way that relationship played out, the part that I played in my relationship with my parents, and everything that happened. So yes, it took me about 2 years plus to get to a point where I could accept it and be thankful for everything that had happened.
Right.
Now, my second answer is about 2 minutes. So there was this point at which I woke up without the anxiety. I had, within a fairly short time, realized what was happening around me, and all of a sudden, it's like everything changed. It's like I suddenly I found my voice, and I suddenly spoke my truth to my husband. It wasn't necessarily very well received, but I spoke my truth, and for the first time ever, I didn't try to explain it. I didn't get involved in a conversation that could be manipulated. I simply said, this is how it is for me, and I'm sorry if it doesn't look that way from your side. So that part of it was very quick. I almost immediately went into this space where I could speak my truth, and I felt okay about it.
Wow. So you've essentially had an epiphany type moment where you've had an instant shift in your perspective. And then you've had those 2 years of really doing that deep inner work. Is that a fair understanding of what you've just explained?
Yeah, totally. The epiphany, and then 2 years of going into those dark places, not being able to work. So I ended up giving up my business at the time because it was very difficult to do anything other than just look inwards. And looking inwards, as you know, as a person who's been through stuff, we all have, there's some very dark moments, and those moments can last for a long time. And what helped me through those was that I was lucky enough, and that's what I was referring to in that post that you quoted at the start. I was lucky enough to have found a rental property that was a farmhouse on 100 acres. So there was lots of space where I could go and scream, sing, dance, kick, visualize things, do whatever my body needed to do to release everything that had built up for a few decades. And then it was gone.
Wow. I feel so much power in what you've just described, so much strength and so much self-discovery. I relate to what you just said, and I'll just tell you a really short little story to exemplify that, because that process is such a turning point for anybody who is needing to heal. And I talk a lot about trust with people, that we need to trust ourselves, we need to trust the process, and we need to have a safe space to explore those things with. And a lot of the counsellors that I used to work with would say, grab a pillow, go outside or go in the back room and scream into it, because you need to release. Your body needs to release. And one of the things that I discovered was incredibly helpful for every woman that was in this particular group with me was learning how to work with felt. And with felt, it's pure wool, which I didn't even know that at the time. And you mix it up with water and soap, and you rub it, you roll it, and then you throw it onto things, throw it on the table, throw it on the wall, throw it wherever you want. And it was such a fantastic physical release. And when you were talking about going out, I could kick things, I could move around, I could just basically change that physical state while you're going through those things. It is so important to be able to do that, to help shift those neural pathways, so that when it does come up again, when that same thought and memory does come up, when you're changing that physical state, there's less and less trauma.
Yeah, I think that the physical stuff is so powerful. I used 2 types of therapy alongside, so I did work with people as well. I worked with a psychologist who was experienced in somatic experiencing, and also EMDR, eye movement desensitization. I can't remember what the R stands for, but it's my EMDR practitioner said exactly that. He said, when you can turn that reaction into a normal memory where you can remember it, you know that it happened, but your body is no longer reacting as though it's happening now.
Yeah.
That's when you know that you're there. And yes, felting. Oh, what a great experience. I've done a little bit of it in my time, and it's beautiful thing to do.
Oh, it is. And you know, the other thing that I discovered with it, and you touched into this a little bit before when you said, you know, the accepted culture of being an overachiever, a perfectionist often goes with that. And with the felting experience, it wasn't like other types of art where you could constrain yourself. It was like, okay, if I'm going to use this to make something, just anything, I need to understand that even once I've beautifully laid out all the colours and the shapes and whatever I want, that after I roll it, it's going to look nothing like that.
Yes.
So it was so important to let go of that process of trying to control it. How did you find that helped you?
Yeah, look, I actually did felting long before this, so probably about 5 or 10 years before this process. So it wasn't part of the process, but I loved it. And it was, I guess, one of the steps. You know, I had the epiphany moment, but there were many steps that led to it.
Yes.
And that was one of them, yes, that letting go of the expectation, letting go of that need to be perfect, that letting go of that disappointment that you feel if what you've put your work into doesn't turn out the way that you thought. And that's been a huge part of all of my life lessons, actually, realizing that perfect is actually not perfection. That it's unachievable, and that the expectation of it creates stress, anxiety. Because another thing I've learned since then is that anxiety is normally felt by people who live in the future, while depression is quite often related to people who live in the past. So this expectation of the future and fear of the future is what feeds anxiety. So the thing about felting, I've done it a few times because a friend of mine was running classes and I really enjoyed it, was one of those little steps that I took throughout the previous years that allowed me to go, oh, okay, things don't need to be perfect.
Yeah.
So it was definitely a defining step, even though it was long before my epiphany moment.
Wow. And I love that you recognize that now. And that's one of the things that I have found as we grow from our adversity, as we learn from those experiences, as we heal and can, like you said, integrate the memory without that full-on body knee-jerk reaction, that we can start to look back and realize, oh, wow, that I was actually taking steps towards this at that point in time. I might not have been ready, but when we add all those steps up together, that has led me to that point in my mind, you know, in my life where I had that epiphany. And hindsight really is a wonderful thing when you can get to that point of being able to look back and separate that traumatic bodily response.
Yeah, and I just as you were speaking then, I thought about how much I love that about life, that you can look back and see how all those steps, everything that's happened has led to this moment now and has led to forming the person that we are now. It made me think of the fact that last year I was truly struggling with something, and I really didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to get through this. And I suddenly sat down and realized, looking back over my life, that every big thing that's happened, I didn't decide. It just happened.
Right.
And that really calmed me. I thought, wow, actually, most of the really big changes in my life just came out of so-called left field. You know, I thought I was going to go this way, And then all of a sudden something happened and I totally changed direction. And that made me really sit back and take stock of the fact that I've always tried to make these big decisions. And in the past, I would have really stressed about them. And now I realize that it doesn't matter what big decision I make, life's going to come up with its own solutions to my problems anyway. So why bother in a way?
I love that. I love that insight. Again, it's trusting the process of life, trusting the journey, trusting yourself that you'll be okay.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's it. We're lucky enough to live in the Western world, in a country where we can say, whatever happens, I will have enough food and a roof over my head. Now, enough food might not be, enough food to fill my belly, but I will have enough food to survive.
Yes.
And I will have enough shelter to survive through whatever happens. And that's all we need, really, in the end.
Yeah. And I know that for myself and a lot of the people I've worked with throughout the years, when you have these moments where you start looking back, and particularly interesting in your situation, because as you said, anxiety is a fear of what you are projecting is going to happen in the future. And so when you got to that point where the anxiety left, you essentially allowed yourself to look back into the past and to sit with that and to feel that and work through it so that you could come back to the present, which to me is a complete full circle moment where you've gone through that process once you were able to step out of that anxiety of projecting into the future.
That's a great observation. Thank you. A great wrap up. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, it's I'm actually, as you know, I'm a very visual person, and I just keep seeing circles with you, and I keep seeing these moments where you're sort of coming into that awareness and then going away again and coming back in and going away, and then that moment where it left you allowed you that possibility to really explore. And I think you're very right where you say that we are very lucky in the country we live in. And gratitude is something that we get a new perspective on when we can look back at our life and when we're not anxious in projecting into the future. And I certainly have found that a lot of my clients reassess their core values when they're at that point in their life where they have looked back, where they have done that inner work, where they are discovering who they are, and that a very big part of that process is understanding and being very clear about what your core values are. You know, those things like being safe, being able to survive on whatever food I can get, having certain people that I can trust, including myself. So how did you find that process helped you perhaps to explore those core values that you have and helped you to discover who you want to be now?
That's a challenging question just because...
It's Vera-Lee from Australia, the founder of the WhyMe Movement and podcast. Well, one idea, one vision, one person. This self-funded podcast and movement has started to take a life of its own, which is exactly where I had planned it would be. To hear the stories of the far-reaching impact across many countries in this world, it humbles me to know that my vision is shared, understood, and positively influencing people to look at the changes they can make for their own adversity and how they can find the strength, the courage to be inspired and feel connected and empowered to use their adversity to their advantage, One of the best ways that you can help support the WhyMe movement and podcast is to subscribe to the various channels, such as the podcast platform you are listening to this on now and the YouTube channel, which has much bonus content released. By subscribing, you will make sure that you are one of the first to find out who is coming up next, more about our guests, and the interesting questions that I ask them, which do not get released on the podcast platforms, and lots of other good bonus content. I always love reading your comments, and so please feel free to leave them on each of the platforms. The beauty of social media is that you can easily share single episodes or any of that bonus content from YouTube onto your own social media platform with your friends, which helps to bring this positive, inspiring message to far more people, allowing you to be an active participant in the WhyMe movement and vision. On Apple Podcasts, it always makes a big difference if you can leave a rating, review, and subscribe to the show. Let's get back to today's story.
We've all got things about ourselves that I guess we don't like to admit to the outside world. And I thought beforehand that I had a very clear set of core values, and I would have professed them to the world. And I thought that that my values were very noble. So it was very interesting to get to a point where I realised that even though I thought that I had been living this life of relying on my intrinsic value and not external gratification, I suddenly realised that, well, actually in my work, if some of my clients didn't show that they appreciated what I was doing for them, I didn't feel that great. So I suddenly realised that, yes, it did matter what other people thought. And it's only through comparison, in the same way that I woke up without anxiety one day, and it's only through that I could know that I had anxiety. It's only when I got to the point of truly knowing that what I am and what I do is enough, and that I can give freely without expectation of anything in return, that I saw how much I wasn't there in the previous years. And it was the same with finances. I talk now about the fact that I feel that I could survive no matter what. And back then, at my epiphany moment, I was living on a farm in a shed, just working 2 days a week because that fed my family. So I thought, and again, I would profess to the whole world if they asked me, I thought that my values were not financially based at all. And yet I now realize that there was this element of finances, and it wasn't about the fact that I was trying to accrue finances, but it was the opposite. My parents were very wealth oriented. So my focus was on not being like my parents.
Right.
So even though I wasn't heading towards wealth, I was trying to get away from it. So my focus was still finance-based, just not in the way that that society sees it. So there are many things like that I now cringe at and think, oh my goodness, I thought I was so wholesome and so noble, and I wasn't. And I'm sure that in another 10 years' time, I look back on me now and say, oh my goodness, that interview I did with Vera.
I love your being so candid and transparent, and you're just showing to myself and all of our listeners that we are all on this journey. And I truly believe that almost everybody who will listen to this will say, yeah, I get it. We've all been there, and we're all going on this journey that is life. And there are going to be choices that we're perhaps not in hindsight proud of, or we may not even agree with those choices anymore. And looking back on our life when we do that, it's important to be kind to ourselves, to say, you know what, I forgive you for that. You were doing the best that you knew at that time. And in particular, when we're talking about anxiety and not even being aware, because awareness of the information our body is giving us is so powerful. And yet, when we're not aware of what's going on, it's a matter of we don't know what we don't know, right?
So true, so true. And I think forgiveness is a huge part of it. There's so much talk about forgiving other people, but forgiving ourselves. I certainly found in my situation, in my trauma years, I guess you could call it, and then in the journey of coming out of them, forgiving the people involved was one process.
Yeah.
But would I say guilt? I'm not sure. The feeling that I got when I realized that I had stayed in a situation that was unhealthy for me for decades, and that I allowed it to happen, and that in some ways I actually fed it because I was getting something out of it. Because let's not kid ourselves, humans don't do anything unless we're getting something out of it, no matter how little it might be or how strange it might seem. That was the longest process, getting to the point where I could look at myself and, as you said before, look at myself in the mirror and say, yes, I not only allowed it to happen, but I made it happen. And that's okay because it was all part of my growth. And as one of my sons said to me not that long ago, they're teenagers, he said, if you're the same person now as you were 10 years ago, then you haven't grown.
Yes.
And I think that's something that I will always remember and treasure. Forgive yourself for whatever you were yesterday even. It doesn't matter. It's all part of growth. And if you can now see more than what you saw then that's a great thing.
Yes, it's something to really pat yourself on the back for, having that extra layer of insight.
Exactly. Even if it is a bit painful and you have to cringe and go, oh my goodness.
Yes.
I don't want to tell that to myself, let alone share it with the world.
Yeah. And look, we all have those cringeworthy moments when we look back at ourselves at various different points in our life. And then we have all of those other memories of things where we did wonderful things, where we made fantastic choices, where we reached in to that place that perhaps we didn't even know existed and found that strength, found that connection to what I quite often call our inner warrior, to find the courage to feel that fear of the uncertainty of a choice, a decision, of ending something like a relationship, which sometimes can be our own type of relationship with other people, and sometimes even our relationship with ourselves, to have to look at, well, do I want to be this person? And one of the most important parts of my healing journey in respect to a significant other person who was my ex-husband, in that the day I finally was able to forgive completely with no reservation, not just saying the words I forgive, but actually truly believing it and feeling the release of that, oh, I can tell the way my body's feeling right now, I actually have forgiven that person, was for me understanding that didn't mean forgetting. So I could still remember that experience. And then, like you were saying, with the somatic healing, I could still remember that experience, but I forgave him. And I knew, again, because we're all human, that he made some really poor choices. I also made choices to be in that relationship. And so I have a level of accountability as well. And sometimes that can be really difficult to own up to. And that is why so many people struggle to get to that point and avoid those situations where they are sitting with themselves with that feeling. Because sometimes there can be shame, sometimes there can be regret, sometimes there can be, who would I have been now if I hadn't done that? So there's an awful lot to unpack in that.
Yeah, I think there are two things that you said that really resonated with me. And the first one was your realization that you need to feel the forgiveness in your body. Because it's one thing to speak the words, and it's a very different feeling. It's that the reality of feeling it in your body. That yes, it's gone. That tension, that stress, whatever it is, that anger, that whatever the feelings are associated with that relationship or the situation are suddenly not there anymore. So that's definitely crucial. And the other thing I wanted to speak to is talking about poor choices and good choices, because I feel like I now feel, there was a time when I didn't, but I now feel that they're all great choices.
Mm.
I feel that, I'll share something here, which is a little bit vulnerable. But when I was extremely angry with the person that I'd spent over 2 decades with, I actually said the words, I needed someone as bad as you to make me stop giving, because I was such a giver. So I now feel, and that was a horrible thing to say to somebody, but at the time it was totally my truth, that I would have just kept giving. I could have spent the next 30, 40 years giving to people and then resenting the fact that I had no energy left for me, but never taking the step to claim that energy.
Right.
So I feel like it was my choice, and it wasn't a poor choice. I needed to make that choice. I needed to go into that relationship and get to the point where I had nothing left to give and realize that there was absolutely nothing coming back at me, that there was no support. I had to get to that point in order to say, okay, for my own survival, something needs to change.
Yeah.
So my message there is that I think they're all great choices. There is no distinction. They're just choices that we need for our growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard a lot of people say lately, I think Tony Robbins said it, I'm not sure, I'll check that quote for later, but you can't grow without the adversity. And that is certainly something that I realized through my process. And, I have an amazing child from that relationship. I have developed such a strong sense of who I am and what I want in my life, to the point where I've not had any significant relationships since, because the type of person that I now seek, that I know will benefit and lift me up, I've not come across yet, and that I'm perfectly okay with that. I tell people I would go through it all again. I would go through that heartache. He was my first love. And I always say to people, I didn't know what love was until I went through that experience. And you used the words earlier yourself about comparison. Now, quite often, as people helping other people, as mentors and coaches, we're telling people not to compare themselves to other people. But you used it in comparing to yourself, in comparing to how you felt, and that comparing to how you felt with anxiety, without anxiety, that was how you knew something was different. And it's very much the same process, that if I hadn't gone through what I went through, not only would I not have this amazing child, I would not have learned what love meant to me and what type of love I then needed. to fulfill my cup. So I love the way that you used that word comparison within yourself and that experience and that information, and that they are all choices that led us to where we are. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and I'm totally thankful for every single one of them. You know, that knowing that I now know what I didn't know before. You know, we always talk about if I'd known then what I know now, well, now I know it, and that's a great thing.
Yes, there's a lot of healing underlying that too. I know that it takes time to get to that point of that knowing, and it's obvious that you've done a lot of that work and are feeling the rewards of it.
Yeah, it's been it has been an amazing journey, and gosh, would I go through it again? Yes, definitely. If I had my choice, I'd probably condense it into 10 years rather than 24.
I like that. Yeah, I think I would like to shorten mine too.
But you know, it was what it was, and there were beautiful moments. It's like with anything, it's so easy to project the negatives, and yet if it was all negative, it's what we speak of because we're here talking about adversity. But of course, if it was all negative, no one would stay in that situation. We're not built that way. It's not natural for our survival.
Yeah.
So there are some moments, and those memories do come back, and they're there and they exist. And I have two beautiful children that have benefited from both being in it and going through the process of change that came with what happened. So I think it's all just part of the process. And I guess there are some things that I would have liked to have known earlier, that I would have liked to have been aware of earlier. But then I also look at myself back then and I think maybe they were in my face, but I wasn't ready for them. You know, I'd never heard of narcissistic personality disorder, but maybe I had. I just wasn't ready to hear it. I'd never heard of other terms, but maybe I had. I just wasn't ready to take that step, and therefore I didn't listen to it. So, I think my takeaway from it all is that we all learn things and we all get things when we need them. And as I said before, I've worked with children with learning issues and nervous system problems. And I always say to parents that children will learn naturally when they're developmentally ready to absorb that information. So there's no need to push any learning onto children. But I also think that that's true for adults. We learn things naturally. We learn our lessons when we're ready for them and not before that. So I guess once upon a time, my noble self would have said, oh, yes, I want to create this course about how I rid myself of anxiety so that other people can benefit and they don't have to go through the stuff that I went through. The me now says, I want to create this course so that it's out there. And I know that those that are ready to take that step will find it because they'll be searching for the answers.
Yeah. That is a beautiful way to approach what you're doing, Tina. And it is so important when we're talking about trauma and recovery. People do take things in their own time. It's like grief. Everybody grieves slightly differently or very differently. People take different lengths of time to go through those processes. Some people will move through some stages very quickly and get stuck on a particular point. Other people will flow from one to the other and then back again, and then working through a process of going back and forth. I have to excuse my coughing today. I'm For some reason, my breathing's playing up a little bit.
Yeah, I understand that. I get the same thing sometimes. So. Yeah, but I think you made a great point there that everyone goes through the journey differently, and it's important to be aware of the waves, because sometimes it can feel so disappointing, and so it can, well, it's sent me sometimes into very black holes when I would go through the high on a wave, go through a realization, a period of feeling really good, and then the next stage of grief would hit me.
Yeah.
And until I learned that it comes in waves and that that's quite normal, that it's this pendulum swinging back and forth, until I learned that and realized that, those downs became deeper downs because I was so disappointed that I couldn't stay on the high. So yes, the process of grieving, and it's we don't just grieve death, because that's normally the word that's associated with grief. The loss of a relationship, the loss of a partner, the loss of a family, the loss of a childhood, whatever it is, we all have to go through the stages of the grief process. And yes, they can come back sometime later. Just 3 or 4 weeks ago, and actually that was my trigger for writing this course. I suddenly woke up with anxiety again. And I thought, oh no, not this again. I thought I was done with this.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just another wave, another stage that I obviously hadn't gone through yet. And I now believe that it was the stage that made me go back into that feeling and really nut out what it is that I do to calm my nervous system, and put it on post-it notes on my mirror. So there was a reason for it, and then it went away.
Yeah, and I also like the fact that you spoke about not working for that intense period of time too, that you're going through this. And it's so important to have not only the space to allow yourself to look back and work out your why, you also need the space after. So when you talk about going into those depths, you need time and space to be able to come out of those in your own time as well. And if you are tied down to places and people where you need to be on a different time clock, that can be very challenging. It doesn't mean it can't be done, but it will take longer, and you will be not allowing yourself to fully be with those emotions and those feelings. And so where possible, it does help to have some space, if not that these things are always planned, because quite often they're not planned. But if you do, if you are able to schedule sessions, for example, on a Friday after work, if you've got the Saturday, Sunday off, things like that help. How would you offer advice to people who might be thinking, listening to this, that, well, maybe this is what I have, maybe it's anxiety, because I can hear what Tina's saying and I can relate to this. How would you advise them to go about their journey from this point to discover if it is, and where to go from there?
I don't know that advice is the word that I like to use. But I guess my one word for anyone that might be going through something is give yourself time to stop and explore. So just that time to stop, time of stillness, which wasn't in my reality for such a long time. And when it came, it almost threw itself upon me. So I often hear people say, I wouldn't have time. I have to go to work. I have to do this and I have to do that. And I learnt, I guess you could say the hard way, that there are no have-tos. I had my own business. It was my only form of income, and I was supporting my entire family from our business. My husband wasn't working. And my anxiety was getting to the point where it was difficult to go to work. So then there was this period where I was going through times when there was no anxiety, and then it would just hit me like a ton of bricks, and I suddenly couldn't go to work. And what I worked out was that if I stayed at home and I was in my quiet space, then I was okay. But as soon as there was any expectations on me, as I mentioned before, I was a giver. I had been a giver.
Yeah.
So as soon as anyone wanted something from me, which is what happened in my work and business, my anxiety would go through the roof. So all of a sudden, I wasn't able to work in my business. So here I am, a university-educated professional, going to Centrelink.
Yeah.
And that was challenging. To say, this is what I need right now, and we're in a country where this is available, and I'm going to use it, and I am going to go to Centrelink and say that I am actually not able to work right now. And I have to say that giving myself that time of stillness was the best thing I ever did. I realized that to have a calm nervous system was my priority in life. And I knew that if I took care of that, everything else would fall into place.
Yeah.
And now we're some years down the track, and that's exactly what's happened. So the piece of advice, I will use the word, that I would give to people is, if you get yourself okay,
Yeah.
then everything else will fall into place. So let go of the fear and prioritize you, because without you, everything will eventually fall apart.
Mm. Yeah. It's very true words, Tina, that you've spoken there, and from real experience, lived in experience, as I call it. And I know that you will have touched many of our viewers and listeners, explaining that. I'd like to discuss another part of a post that you put up. Now, this post you have, and I'm just looking at the moment, 2 pictures of a tree trunk. And one is what looks like either early morning or late afternoon. There's some dabbled shadows, there's quite bright sunlight and quite vibrant colours. We've got a beautiful deep blue sky behind, and the next day, or however many days are in between, the next period, the picture is a lot more dull. We've got a very overcast white sky behind. It's exactly the same place. And the tree trunk itself is very grey, and the colours are not very vibrant. And even the greens in the background are nowhere near as warm or vibrant. And what you said about this, part of what you said, if I can quote you, different day, different light, different mood. It amazes me how much our perception of an object, person, situation, circumstance, even a place can differ from one moment to the next. Blue sky or grey sky, light mood or heavy mood, morning or afternoon, full moon or a new moon. It's crazy. Nothing is solid and stable. Everything is changeable, malleable, waiting for us to see it how we choose to. We can create our world so it fits in with our perception of it. I love what you wrote there, and with the visual representation, same tree trunk, different times, so symbolic of that journey that we've been discussing here today.
Yes, we see things how we want to see them. We create our own reality.
We do. And you alluded to it in one of your other posts, that what we focus on can be either stepping stones to help us get where we want to go or the bricks in the way of our path.
Yeah, there's I use a lot of analogies that are around perception and focusing because my profession, my university training is in optometry.
Yes.
And as I was going through the process of being an optometrist, now I worked as a developmental and behavioral optometrist, so it's all about the connection between the vision and the brain.
Mm.
And one of the things I learned was that there are an enormous number of nerves going from our brain back towards our eyes, filtering what our visual system allows in.
Yeah.
The amount of nerves is bigger than our entire auditory system. So I often use these analogies because in the years post optometry, as I was discovering more and more about the human brain and how we work and the human beings that we are, I realized that so much of the terminology that I used in my behavioral optometry practice actually applies to life.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love the parallels in that.
Yeah, I picked up on that with a lot of what you post on your feed, that you are constantly drawing those parallels and making those connections from what we see and how we see it. And it is so beautiful that you're at that point of awareness in your life to be able to do that.
Yeah, I always think of a song by Lily Allen. I don't quite remember how old the song is, and I don't remember the name of the song, but the film clip was of this young girl singing the song, walking through the streets of a city and seeing colours and seeing these beautiful things, and then walking through the city again as the song goes on, and seeing it totally differently, seeing the discarded needles and the homeless people. And that's the vision that always comes into my mind when I think about the fact that we create our own reality, that our perception of how things are is based on how we're feeling inside. And I guess that takes it back to what I said before when you asked about advice for people. I believe that all growth happens from the inside. So if we can get to the core, if we can fix the roots of whatever the problem is, if we can get to the core of the issue and sort that out, then everything else literally grows out of that really easily, really naturally.
Yeah, it's about having that solid base, isn't it? For essentially, as some people call coming home, it's having that space within us that we know and we don't need to make any excuses about. We don't need to be trying to form it into anything but what it is. And once we get to that level of acceptance, that is our foundation from which we can thrive, from which we're planting that seed in there and allowing it to flourish. Mm.
Exactly. And I think our society so often tells us that we don't have time to make space to grow that, to plant that seed.
Mm.
And my message is we must make the time. It's the only thing that matters. It is the most important thing.
Yeah, it is. I am feeling so grateful that you've come on here today to share your story. And I know that a lot of our listeners are going to walk away with so much to think about in a positive way. If they wanted to reach out to you, how would they do that?
I have a Facebook page, tinafuller.com. Email tina@tinafuller.com, and that's Tina, Tina spelled Tina, at tinafuller.com. I also have a website which has been going live for the last 2 months, but isn't yet. But that will be online shortly, tinafuller.com. So
Wonderful.
if you search Tina Fuller, Tina, Fuller, you'll be able to find me.
Wonderful. I will make sure that I put those links in the description. And thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Vera. It's been lovely knowing you.
You too.
I love the fact that you put it as a conversation.
It was a wonderful conversation, and I thank you for being authentic. And as you've just explained, normally with these, the way that a lot of these things go, you get given questions, you prepare, and I deliberately avoid that where possible, because that takes away some of that authenticity and it takes away some of that rawness. And my vision in the WhyMe movement is to allow people to feel what I felt talking to you and what I felt talking to pretty much every guest so far, is that connection and that rawness. And if you plan for that, it won't happen.
Exactly. Beautifully said. That connection and that rawness that you can't plan. It's just there and it comes out in the moment, and it's all about being in that moment. It's perfect.
Yeah. And see, I suppose I understand that because of the way my creativity works and the way that I learned through my own healing and my own journey that I'm still on, and gratefully on, in that exploration. So I'm very similar. There's only a few memories that I will still cry to. And most of the time the tears will run and I'm still talking like I am now. Maybe the lips will quiver a little bit. And that's okay, because they're the sort of moments that I hope I never lose that connection to, because they were the ones that rocked my core, you know. At the same time, you know, I use all of those memories and all of those emotions and all of those feelings and all of that connection, and I trust that intuitive process when I create. And so for me, like I mentioned to you when I was talking, I was seeing a lot of circles, you know, and that process as well, that can't be forced. You know, so it's very much the same as the way that I do the interview series. I just turn up and see what happens and respond to what's happening, because that is how we live our life most of the time. You said it. You hit the nail on the head. Didn't matter what choices I thought I was going to make about the big things. Life had its own design for where I was going to go. And it's very much the same process. I'm very thankful that you chose to come on, and I felt that vulnerability and it was beautiful. And to know, I can feel how connected you are to that process.
Yeah, it's real. It's totally real. Yeah.
Definitely. It's wonderful.
Thanks.
Sorry about my coughing today. My vocal cords are playing up a little bit. Imagine that visualization, and being a very visual person, you'll understand me when I explain that when I lost my voice at two pivotal moments in my life, during my most severe first sexual assault, and not being able to verbalize what had happened until quite a long way along the healing process, I did that through the art, and in particular through felt. And I put it all out there to the point where it was very powerful. And then people's reactions to that work visually allowed me the courage to not only further explore that, but to find my voice. So that was the first time I found it after losing it. The second time I lost my voice was for a 2-year period, when Botox was injected in one of my vocal cords, and therefore it kept me breathing and living, but I had no verbal communication skills for 2 years and wasn't even aware that I would ever get them back. At that time, they didn't have treatment for me. So throughout that period again, I prolifically created a lot of artwork and did a lot of photography, and all of my artwork starts as a photograph. And I don't know if I've told you the process I go through with creating it.
No.
No, okay.
No.
So when I get images in my mind about certain feelings and things and events and people, what I do is I photograph 4 shapes, for light and shadow. I then strip that photograph back down to essentially its bare framework. And then I layer in. And it's like, this is what we do when we're healing, and when we have that moment of, when we have that epiphany, it is a complete stripping back of everything to go, oh, this is who I am in this moment. And then as we heal and as we look back and realize all of the different things that have led us there, and we put it all together, that's that layering process of laying it back in. And at the end, you have this amazing transformed piece of artwork.
Love that. That's beautiful. Yes, that's great. Take it all out and then put what you want back in.
Yeah, and very symbolically putting in. So very focused on those colours that, have got that deep meaning and connection to you, to who you were, to who you are now, and who you want to be. And it encompasses all of that in a visual medium. So it's very, very powerful.
That's amazing. You just reminded me of something my acupuncturist said while I was going through a whole heap of stuff. And I went to her once and I said, I just feel so empty. And it wasn't a good empty. It was like empty, like there was nothing in my life. All of a sudden, my family, my job, my farm, my home, everything that had been in my life up to that moment was gone. And I just felt total emptiness. And she said, that's great. Now be careful what you fill it in with.
Yeah, wise words.
Yeah, it was, it's something that I often come back to and I go, oh, do I actually want this in me now?
Yes.
So it sounds very much like what you're doing with the layering. Take it all out, but then very specifically bring things in. Be careful about what you bring back in.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. So it's a journey in itself.
Yes, yeah. And do you feel it? Like, how is it for you emotionally when you're creating? Do you feel the other person while you're doing it?
Yes, because I don't get the inspiration of what to do without it. So when I was talking with you, for example, about those circles, at the moment I have a lot of circular feeling, and circles are very symbolic of a lot of things, and not just the way that I talk about full circle moments. Circles can mean lots of things to different people. It can mean having a global overview of our life. It can mean looking right in at the cellular level to ourself, of the core of who we are. There's so many different ways that you can take a perspective on it. I was actually seeing quite a lot of greys and blacks, interestingly enough, because usually when I get these energies, I feel a lot of colour. And I was seeing a lot of greys and blacks, but I was seeing a fair bit of red as well. And I don't know if they resonate with you at all, but they were definitely the colours that were immediately coming to me. They're not the only colours, because there's still some other stuff going on there, but that was what I was feeling quite strongly with those circles. And I suppose you'd explain it like, I am not a clairvoyant or anything like that. I don't even profess to be anything like that. But I'm trying to think of the only way I can explain for people to sort of grasp that concept. I just feel, and I have learned to trust that feeling. And in that connection that we make as people to other people, it's that energy connection. For me, that's a visual thing.
Mm. Yeah, I understand that. I see things in pictures as well and analogies, and I have little movies play out that then
Yes.
turn into analogies,
Yes.
and I totally get the intuition part of what you're talking about. I recently did a course with William Whitecloud. Have you heard of him?
No.
He's a South African who lived in Australia for a long time. And now he's in the US somewhere, maybe Mexico, can't remember, somewhere in the Americas. But he has, maybe look up William Whitecloud so that I don't go through a whole thing.
I will. I'm going to write
I
it down
did
now.
I did a course with him, and I'm actually signed up for the second one. It's all about intuition. It's all about it's interesting because it's all about going into a circle.
Oh, is it?
There's the symbolism of a circle, and you have your victim circle and your creator circle.
Yes.
And stepping into the creator circle to create what you want in life.
Yes.
But it's also a lot of it is about simply looking at a person, so going into a state of innocence.
Yes.
Where you sort of let go of all your beliefs and everything that you know and logic, and simply looking at a person and just saying what's obvious. And that sounds like what you're using in your art, where you just feel into the person and it just comes.
Yeah.
And his
much.
messages that we all have it. But of course, some of us attune to it more than others. And I loved the course because I've always felt like I had, even when I was doing optometry, I did it very intuitively. You know, all my friends would be able to name all these things and or answer questions on exams, and I'd be saying, but I don't know until the person's in front of me.
Yeah.
I don't know how to solve their problem.
Yeah.
So, and at one point, I went to a conference where I very sheepishly described my process of solving people's vision problems. And the person running it said, "Oh, so you do it intuitively." And that was the first time that I'd heard the word intuitive. I went, "Oh, yes, yeah, okay, that's what I do."
Okay.
So it was great to do this course because it allowed me to, I guess, be okay with how I do things.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just while you were talking gained a lot more clarity around the black circles. That very much like you were saying, you have your victim bubble, if I can say bubble, circle bubble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have your creator one, and which even explains the red as well, because at the core of who we are, we start with our blood that's flowing right through us, and that's our life source essentially within the physical form, which is red. Mm-hmm. And then the black is very much a barrier. And when you were in that space where you didn't have the awareness, that information was still there, but it was essentially barricaded in, and you weren't allowing yourself to be aware of it to then act on it. That makes sense.
That's very powerful. That's you've definitely got something, Vera. It's interesting because I have a friend who I don't see very often, but she's quite intuitive, and we hadn't seen each other for months, and we still haven't. But she messaged me a little while ago, just a few weeks ago, and said, "I did these 2 paintings, and for some reason I felt that you should have one of them." And they're all circles. It was just so that's interesting. And the other thing I'll say is he talks about blacks and whites and greys and reds.
Does he?
And they're not my so this you just spoke about blacks and whites and reds.
Yes.
They're not my favorite colors at all. I love blues and turquoise. So when you said that, I thought, oh,
yes.
But underneath the clothing you can see, I'm actually wearing red and grey today.
Oh, you are. How interesting. Another full circle moment. Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, intuition is, I think, when we're open to it, our way of tapping into that energy. So it makes perfect sense now that you've connected those dots.
Okay.
I wasn't aware of that logically, and I wasn't aware of that information, but hey, there it is at work.
And that's one thing that William Whitecloud says, you don't need to know why.
Yeah.
Don't take logic out of it, because as soon as you allow logic to come in, you'll lose what you actually had. You'll actually lose the flow. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, you're not connected to that intuitive energy anymore. Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about this process that I do. On occasion, only very odd occasion, do I get people that say, that doesn't resonate with me at all. I don't know. You know what the interesting thing is, though? It doesn't resonate with them at that time.
Yes. Yeah.
Intuition doesn't have a timeline. So a lot of the time it might be years later that they go, oh, that's what that meant. I finally got it, and then they're like, oh, that's so powerful. But at the time they were blocked. They didn't want to know about it.
I love that. I think that's so true. That thing, you don't see it until you're ready for it. So I love that you say that too, that sometimes people don't resonate with it yet.
Yes.
They haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
Yes. And like you alluded to, sometimes the reaction is, because they're not the colours that we particularly like. They're not the shapes that we particularly like. And that part of it is you subconsciously being confronted by that, because that's such a defining moment in your life. So again, it makes sense.
Mm.
And it makes that message more powerful.
Yes, and I resonate with circles. So I told you the story about my friend, but look, whenever I allow myself these days to be artistic and just free flow with pens or pencils or whatever, I realise I always do swirls. It's always spirals and swirls, and it's very, very
fluid.
circular, very fluid,
That's very cool.
So that's interesting. Mm. Lovely.
Thanks, Tina.
Another interview. That was lovely. It was very good for me.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Thanks, Vera.
All right. Take care. Well, another story, more WhyMe moments, and more reasons to feel inspired to change your adversity into your advantage. An integral part of the vision of the WhyMe movement is the ICE acronym, I for Inspire. When you feel inspired, you are more likely to take action. C is for two things, actually. Connection. You are not alone in this world. There are always people here who want to help you get through your adversity and feel positive about your life and your purpose. It is also for courage. Courage, in my opinion, is feeling the fear and doing it anyway. And there lies the importance of connection. For sometimes we don't feel we have the courage to do things on our own. And yet once we have the emotional support of those people who we trust, it can help us to feel that fear and do it anyway. And lastly, the E is for empower. When we have that connection and the courage and the inspiration to know, get our clarity of purpose, well, that is when we feel empowered to take the action that we want to do to change some aspect of our lives for the better. If you would like my personal support in this area to help you get through adversity in your life, you can contact me at Vera-Lee Original on social media.